You can be happy.
Welcome to another in the series brought to you by the Missoula Peace Network. Let's posit a scenario. You're trying to prevent a war, or maybe there's a toxic waste dump in your backyard, or a housing crisis. In any case, you get together as an activist in a group. You come together as a group to have a more powerful influence, and yet you have a particular job you want to get done that's active. Still, if we're trying to do social change, we have to start with our own groups first if we're going to really carry forward to it and not fall into the trap of classism, sexism, racism, or elitism. Today we're going to talk about activist groups and democratic process. Do we mirror the power structure? We'll outline some of the processes that you can use to come to agreement within groups or to structure groups, and then we'll consider a recent example, the ad hoc Student Coalition for Social Responsibility that was able to quickly address the Persian Gulf War in the fall, but then eventually tripped up somewhat over their internal structure and had to deal with it, which they successfully did. My name is Jim McGrath. I'm with the Missoula Greens. Bridget Crocker, I'm sorry, is a member of the Student Coalition. J.B. Bennett, also another member of the Student Coalition at the University of Montana. David Host has been an activist for a number of years, was in the anti-nuclear weapons movement, and now works at the food bank. Heather Hammond has been an activist also for a number of years and has been involved in the Rainbow Family and some of the alternative work that they've done. And over here, Nina Kramer is co-chair of the Montana People's Action Board, which addresses low-income issues across the state. And Nina, you've had some pretty positive experience with what most people think of when we say democratic process. That's a majority vote, set up elected leaders and so on. Why don't you explain how MPA operates?
Okay, at Montana People's Action, we are a grassroots organization it starts out at the very local level of our community neighborhoods that are organized from the community neighborhoods, sometimes organizing around an issue such as daycare issues or a stop sign issue, school closures and stuff. A group of people come together to start work on the issues that affect the neighborhood themselves. Out of that neighborhoods that are organized around these issues, elected leadership is then sent to our county boards. We are now a statewide organization, and we are set up across the state in several different communities. And we have county boards that operate sort of the basic operations they're responsible for are seeing that the neighborhood organizations are on task and the issues that they are working on through their elected representation to the overall county boards. And the county boards then supervise an office and the running and stuff of that. Basically, we're very structured we try to follow Robert's Rules of Order. Just to give us a framework to work into, we're unique in the fact that many of our decisions do come by a consensus vote because we're very communicative with each other, and we pride ourselves on that no one will come into a board meeting and be surprised by an issue or something that comes up that may be of concern of someone. We try to have information available to all the board members beforehand so that they can come in and make the best possible choice with the most amount of information possible to do that with. From those county boards, then we have elected representation that goes to what we call the state board that oversees the whole state operation, how that works, how its expansion would be. Are we to open another office? How is the staff working out in the offices that we do have open? What kinds of issues on a statewide level might we want to look into doing? And again, we're very communicative on that level. A lot of times people come in maybe with some concerns or something like that, but those are usually addressed before a board meeting so that people, again, can be able to research that issue. If there's some discontent about something, people are able to research it, get some facts behind it, and hopefully we see this as a real positive way to have everyone be able to have their say and then be able to come to a decision that would be best for the organization. Now for us, this has worked out real well because everybody feels that they do have the opportunity to speak their piece, and we can act adult about it, and therefore you can feel good about the decision. Maybe it's not exactly the way you would have perceived it in the beginning, but you can feel that you have made a good decision, some good choices, because you have had the information, you've had some time to digest that, and then we can go on from there. And it seems to be real effective for us.
And so this is elected by the membership, so there's a lot of accountability to the membership, and is there involvement of grassroots members?
Most definitely, and we encourage that. All of our board meetings, even at the state level, are open to all of the membership to come and participate in. All discussions are open, and everyone is recognized by the chair, be it the elected representative for that group or just a member at large. Always gets an opportunity to be recognized by the chair. When it comes down to an actual vote, if we need to take a vote on an issue, then just elected representation votes. But that doesn't preclude the local membership from asking for a caucus to talk with their local representative in order to make sure that their views are being expressed
now
the way that they wish.
On the state board, how many votes does each area get?
Okay, how we are organized right now at the state board, we have offices in Billings, in Great Falls, Missoula, and in the Bitterroot area. And our Bitterroot group is our smallest group, and several years ago we restructured how our state board was determined in order to make sure that smaller groups could have an equal say in the decisions that were being made. Just the fact of lower population should not preclude them from having an equal voice in our organization. So once you hit the 30-member mark, you get one vote on the state board, and then as it grows, it goes up to a total. Any one given area could have 3 votes on the state board. As we currently are set up right now, Billings, Missoula, and Great Falls each have 3 votes, and the Bitterroot chapter has 1 vote. And we do not allow proxy votes. If your chapter representatives cannot make it to a meeting, no proxy votes are allowed. So it's worth your while if there's an issue particularly of interest in your community that you feel should be addressed, perhaps at a state level. We're currently working on some statewide issues. Then you want to make sure your leadership from your community gets there so that your views can be expressed.
That particular structure prevents any one locality from being dominant on the board.
Oh, definitely. And some interesting dynamics come out of that and stuff too, because many times you would think maybe a smaller community wouldn't have as big a voice as the larger communities because it only gets 1 voice, but in this particular instance, the way we're structured at this point in time. However, it's interesting how even the larger communities can split. We seem to have such a unique population in Montana. It seems to work out real well for us that then those people that come to the state board tend to be with the consideration ahead of time of making sure information and stuff is available. Then that leads to sometimes some interesting votes and some interesting discussion and dynamics at those meetings.
Great, thanks, Nina. Heather, you have a rather unique experience with an ancient and successful way of doing things with your background with the Hopi. Could you tell us about that?
Well, I've lived for many years in the Southwest, about 16 years, and during that time I became acquainted with some Hopi traditional elders. Grandfather David Menunge especially was someone that I was very close with, and through work that I've done in helping out with the Big Mountain legal defense, I worked a lot with Navajo traditional elders also in that area, and I learned through years of working with them that in their traditional form of government, or the Hopis in specific, they are governed by, or have been governed up until 1934 by their religious spiritual leaders who are called the Kikmungwis. And the Kikmungwis would come together and counsel in the kivas when they had a decision that they needed to make that affected the group. And the Hopis have lived on these mesas for at least 2,000 years, and they have used this form of government for probably much longer than that. And they would discuss things in the kiva, with the Kickmunguis. And lots of times these decisions that they needed to make were very important. It, the survival of their people really depended on it, that a good decision be made. And they really respected their religious leaders, and this whole group had been together for so long that they were very bonded with one another. And the Kickmunguis will discuss an issue until everyone has said what they need to say about it. And they would speak in a circle and respect whoever was speaking. And they would allow as much time in between the speakers for everyone to contemplate on what had just been said, to just really listen and contemplate so that they could understand what was being said and what point was being made. And they would speak for however long as they needed, days or weeks or whatever. And when they finally decided, would come to a decision about it, it would be a full consensus, 100% consensus of everyone agreeing to a particular point of action. And with the Navajo people, it was a little bit different because they're kind of spread out, or have been, very spread out, and they're sheep herders, and they would have their consensus would be through their head clans people, and they would come together. Not that often because they didn't always live in the same place, but an example of when they did have to come together to make an important decision. Back in 1923, Standard Oil came into the area and did some exploring, and they wanted to get an oil lease to drill on Navajo land. And they said, well, how are we going to, get this group of people to give us permission to do this? And the head clansmen all came together and they had a council about it, and they agreed after, I don't know how long the process took, but they agreed, 75 of the head clansmen agreed not to issue a lease to Standard Oil. And shortly after that, the government decided, well, this isn't going to work. We can't deal with these people. We can't get what we need. So they passed the Indian Reorganization Act, which was passed in 1934, which forced each Indian nation to accept a majority rule type of format and elected tribal councilmen, not along the lines of their religious leaders. And this happened all over the country. And what happened with the Hopis was that the Hopi Kickmunguis got together and they decided that they would not accept this tribal council, and that it was not representative or in their traditional way of decision making. And so for the last 36 years or so, they have boycotted this tribal system, and the other traditional Hopis and Navajos have boycotted this system and say that, that this does not represent them at all. And the reason why they believe in the consensus is because they feel that when 100% of the people agree, then there's no dissatisfied minority, and that enough time has been given that an appropriate decision, the correct decision, has been made for the benefit of all the people, and that they haven't been forced or rushed into making a decision. So this is how they've done it.
Great. And now they take as much time as they need, but perhaps in the scenario I presented earlier, an activist group might be trying to come rapidly to a decision in the heat of action, so to speak, and yet many activist groups have organized operate on the basis of consensus. And Dave, will you explain maybe why that system developed and how it works?
I can explain it from my experience in that I got involved with anti-nuclear weapons work in 1976, and from 76 to 78 I was involved with groups that basically either worked on a majority rule system or became dissatisfied with the majority rule system and threw out all structure. And in both systems, what seemed to me to happen was that the most assertive and the most vocal personalities either were able to muster the majority or just to, in the case of no structure, bulldoze through their agenda. And generally that meant white males, and generally older white males. And so when I and some others moved back to the Midwest, and back there they were using what was called at that time a monster manual, which was put out by the Movement for New Society out of the Midwest, and it had structures in there for consensus decision making, which they'd drawn on from the Hopi, from the Quakers, and other groups. And I just became an advocate of it because for a number of reasons. First of all, what was already mentioned by Feather, which is that there were no resentful, and I don't, dissatisfied perhaps, but resentful also minorities, because every individual is required to say yay or nay to whatever, both the statement of the problem and the solution. And so there's an intense burden, some people might call it, or opportunity for personal responsibility. And also no hierarchy, because there aren't any representatives. It isn't like you have a person that you believe in and then they meet all together and have a consensus. It's everybody and anybody that's involved. And without those minorities, those resentful minorities, what wouldn't happen is what I talked about earlier before the show, was that what would happen often is these white, assertive, vocal males would take over for a while, and then it would create a backlash out of nowhere from a feminist female group that had been meeting on the side about in a dissatisfied way, and the males would be going, where did that come from? I thought everything was just going fine. I mean, I don't understand. And so there wasn't that kind of backlash. Everybody knew where everybody stood. And that it created a real need for creative negotiation. Because what happens is that if one person objects, then that objects to it on a moral ground or on a ground that they just can't live with it, then the whole group has to find another solution that includes this person's ideas about things. And that's a tremendously creative process to bring somebody in who may be out in left field, or may be in fact the one person who sees this thing clearly and has to somehow convince other people. I've seen that. One thing I did want to bring up is a disadvantage, even though I'm an advocate of consensus. I think it's already been brought up that the slowness of the process may be a problem. I think also a problem is when you first move into it, people come with their own baggage, and they may have been repressed most of their lives just because they're not vocal and male and white. And so when they suddenly are presented with a structure where they can stop things in their tracks, if they want to, they may find that this is just exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop this baby in its tracks. And you have to deal with the fact that people are using this process as therapy in some cases. So, and it's a life-changing process. So that's why I'm an advocate of consensus.
Thanks, Dave. And respect is a key underlying thing in consensus, and the situation that the stopping it, you have to move to a point where every individual is listening and being respectful to the others for it to work.
And it's interesting that one of the sections of the consensus process, which is brainstorming solutions, one of the hardest things for people who are just beginning the process to do, which is to, when they hear someone's solution, to not criticize it. I've seen it over. You may say it 100 times before the process starts. Don't brainstorming. You don't criticize. Well, somebody brings up a solution, and the very next solution that's brought up is brought up as counter to that solution. And it's real hard for us to not be critical. So that's where respect comes in.
Thanks. So in the Greens, we do a variety of processes that are sort of in between. A great deal of our decisions are made by consensus basis, especially at a local level. As we get into the national group, we'd go for a high majority vote for most policy decisions. One reason behind that is that because of the idea of accountability, when you select a spokesperson or a representative and then they say they travel somewhere, if they have a particular thing that the group has said you must do this, then there's the possibility of consensus fails because they aren't in a position where they can negotiate and be creative without going back to their group. So nationally, we have a fallback to a high majority vote that we think does a lot of the same kinds of things in making sure that everybody's close in the way that they're feeling about things. Certain minor decisions a smaller group might make by quick majority vote just to move it along. But one of the factors is the degree of seriousness of the decision. And as Feather described, the elders, when they're talking about the hugely important decisions of survival, consensus becomes essential. And so when we're talking about say something like changing a charter, or if it's an action-oriented group doing a particular action, maybe civil disobedience, consensus is essential because of the seriousness of the decision, and that no individual should have to participate in a decision of that seriousness without consenting to it. And that's why consensus has come about. And all of these strategies can be effective and can be empowering and can involve people. They all seem to have similar goals in terms of accountability, of leadership to members, involvement of all the members, and openness of the process. No secret agendas, no preset agendas, that everybody can somehow participate and then be satisfied with the outcome. Now, when the student coalition formed in just the last fall, noticing the war was coming along and something had to be done, what was it that you guys developed?
Well, I think the essence of the early stage of the coalition was that we're making this up as we go. When the students first got together in late October for the first march that we had on Halloween, it was just a bunch of students who had gotten together to talk about a problem, decided something had to be done, and decided to do something. And so they sort of started calling around and setting things up. And they, at that time, really hadn't thought about being a group, so to speak. They made up some name, Student Coalition for Social Responsibility, because several ASUM groups were involved in it. It was a coalition of groups. And I think at that time there was some expectation that the coalition wasn't something that was meant to last. And so no real thought at all was given to the structure. And so the first march went incredibly well. It was the largest march to date, to that date, that had happened at any college campus in the country. And the organizers were just overwhelmed by the success and the interest that students had in the issue. And I came on board during the march, so I wasn't there for that very first stage. And then what happened after that first march was we realized that we had something. We had a group that could do something. And so we now had an identity as a group, not just a bunch of groups getting together to do something, but the Student Coalition for Social Responsibility took on a life of its own. And now that we had a group, we had to figure out how we were going to organize this group or not organize this group. And it was decided fairly early on that some sort of organization was necessary, but everyone was a little wary of having anyone as the leader, or even a defined leadership, so to speak, even a committee. And we also weren't entirely comfortable with majority rules. At that point, we were introduced to the consensus process by David Host and by Jim McGrath. And admittedly, we never understood it fully and still don't. But we decided that that would be our basis for organizing. So we used the consensus process, except in certain situations, like when we'd plan a march and we had reached consensus that there would be a march in this area at this date, and then we had a couple different options about the route. And we decided to go to majority rule. We reached consensus to do majority rules on whether to go from the courthouse to the campus or the campus to the courthouse. We decided that that just wasn't a real useful expenditure of our energies to reach a total consensus on one of those questions. We felt it was important to reach that original consensus to do it first, and to limit a certain number of options. And while we were doing this, we really were trying very hard in our own minds to be sensitive to sexism issues, racism issues, and it's the sexism issue that really hung us up. And gosh, we thought we were doing awfully well there for a while. We had to make sure there was gender balance at each speak out, and gender balance here and gender balance there, and at least for some of us, I think the fact that we appeared to be doing so well created sort of a trap, and a lot of real subtle, but by no means insignificant sexism snuck in to the way we were doing things. It did end up being white males dominating the group. And part of the way that seemed to happen was there were a lot of decisions that need to be done for this march. We didn't take enough time to figure out what we were doing. We just kept going from one action to the next and trying to get everything covered for that action. And so, because this needed to be done by this time and somebody needed to take responsibility for it, we kept having these little groups meeting to plan things out. And next thing we knew, they were setting agendas for the big meeting, and then those agendas would get pushed through. So even though we attempted to not fall into these traps, we did, simply because we hadn't taken the time to sit down and figure out what it was we were doing. Eventually, that really did become a problem in our organization. It was something we had to address.
Maybe Bridget can give her perspective on it, which was somewhat different experience than we're being successful and being fair and avoiding sexism.
Well, I seem to be noticing that there weren't any vocal females within the group, and that I felt personally very alienated from the processes that were taking place within the group. As far as during meetings, I felt like that a lot of men were being given priority to their ideas are being given priority to women's ideas, and that men were dominating the meetings, and that they were setting agendas for these meetings in these secret meetings that were happening before the group meetings. And so I started to really feel discontented about that. And it didn't really quite hit me until at the teach-in that the coalition put on, I think it was in March or February?
March, I think.
When there was a group that formed saying how, it was mostly women, saying how we felt alienated from the entire peace movement in Missoula. And we thought that the whole structure was very linear and very alienating to women. So we kind of formed and thought that we would try and set our own agendas and do what we thought was best in the way of protesting the war from a feminine perspective. And I kind of brought this up to a few of the coalition members, and they were, as Jim said, very aghast that this had been happening, because they had been trying to pay so much attention to sexist issues. And here were some women who were feeling very alienated, and we started talking amongst ourselves, the women in the group, saying, yeah, I've been feeling that way too. And we kind of all reached a point where it needed to be discussed, and it needed to be brought up to the people who we felt were dominating and controlling the agendas and controlling what the group was doing. And so we had a big meeting where everyone who we thought was involved got together, and we kind of just hashed it out for 7 hours and came up with some really positive results. People who thought that they hadn't been sexist realized that they had, and people who felt like they'd been alienated realized that they had things to say, and it was just a problem with structure that had interfered with that. So I think that meeting was really positive in a lot of ways, because a lot of people felt really included in the group after It had been discussed, and a lot of people felt really, I felt a lot closer to the people that I've been working with than I had previously.
So how, what kind of things resulted from that? How did the coalition operate in the days following that?
Well, that's yet to be seen. The coalition so far has had 3 meetings basically working on reformation, and it's kind of at a lull right now because people aren't as interested in the war anymore. People are into doing other things because they feel like their energies are being wasted on anti-war movements. So I think it's yet to be seen what the manifestations of that meeting are. But I think as far as the leadership in the group and the way it interacts with the community, it's been much more gender balanced. There's been much more emphasis on women taking part in expressing the coalition's views, and that's been stressed by male participants in the coalition, saying that women need to have a more active voice, and it's also opened a lot of doors for people who feel that they've been alienated to say things, because we all said what we felt, and things came of it. So it opened a lot of doors for communication and saying how we really felt and having people respond to that, and it was really positive in that way.
One thing I'd like to add to that, one of the results I saw coming out of it is we became more supportive of each other. Mm-hmm. One of the subtle sexist things that crept into the group that I remember, and I remember the moment I realized it, was sort of this competitive feeling that you had to keep doing stuff to stay in the in-group, and it was really hard to figure out who the in-group was at any given moment, because there were these secret meetings. It wasn't that it was meant to be secret, not have anyone. They'd just get called, and not everybody would be there, and it tended to be the shifting group, although there tended to be a few individuals who were at almost every one. But there was this feeling that maybe you were left out because you weren't doing enough or something like that. So you'd try and get more involved and do more, and always feeling like you weren't quite doing enough. And I remember really feeling that. And because I'd been raised to be a male in our culture, I just sort of assumed that was the way it was. And one day after, we decided to just have a party for once, and Bridget was outside because she was pissed off at some of us, and I was out there chatting with her. And she was explaining why she was feeling bad about it, and she was explaining that feeling of having to try and catch up with it, keep up with everything. And I remember saying, "Well, Bridget, I feel that way too." And then Bridget looked at me and said, "Well, do you suppose there might be something wrong with that?" And I just was dumbstruck. What? No, I hadn't ever thought of that before. Yeah, it is a little difficult. And that was when I started realizing that we hadn't been very supportive of each other, and that this patriarchal, competitive structure had snuck into the coalition, or had been in the coalition all along. And one of the real positive things I saw coming out of the meeting that we had, where we talked it all out, was not just sharing the things that need to be done, but sharing the feelings that we were having while we were doing them. And I think the coalition members became much more supportive of each other in that. During that meeting, and since then, I felt a lot more support and a lot more emotional contact with everyone in the group.
Right, that's one thing that happened while we were working so hard together to accomplish all these things and contact the media and be on shows and be in the news and do all these things that needed to be done. We had never found out about each other at all. I didn't know where anybody was from. I didn't know people's last names. I didn't know anything about the people I was working with. And I think that's an essential thing to know before you get in a group and work so closely with people, is just basic life sharing. I think that's really important, to get to know the people that you work closely with.
So what would you advise to a student group in the future that has to face some of the same problems that you guys did?
Well, I would say, first of all, sit down, go around the circle and say where you're from, what kind of things you enjoy, what kind of thoughts you have, and get to know one another first, and get to know each other's personalities, and work off of each other instead of working with a structure. Supposedly, I think most structures are patriarchal just in the sense that they're a structure. I think you need to work off of one another, and a structure will develop that includes everybody, instead of what happened in our situation where there was no structure at all, but there wasn't any life sharing either, so it ended up to be a structure in a sense. I think we really need to focus on getting to know each other and including everybody as a human being, and that's what I would advise.
I'd like to throw something in there. It's kind of like experiencing hot by being cold, learning from the outside, is that when I went back to the Midwest, it had happened that in this larger organization of communities, people, there had been a feminist backlash against the patriarchal system that had been there for a while, and now the matriarchs were in power. And so I learned what it felt like to be in a position where it felt smothering. Wherever you turned, and so I'm saying that when the matriarchs get together, they have a way of making men feel frustrated and smothered by. It's interesting. Men coalesce around action, okay. Women coalesce around community and getting to know one another and that kind of thing. And so when men would propose actions, well, that would slowly be absorbed to the point of to the point, where nothing would happen, and the men would go back, and try and figure out what happened there. What happened there? And then the men would propose another action, and it would get absorbed into an endless series of potlucks. And and so I learned what it felt like to be on the other side of, and they were very conscious of how that was working from their side. They were upfront about, we're not going to have any more patriarchal systems here, and the way we're going to do that is to make sure that this endless series of potlucks absorbs whatever male energy comes in through your segment of the population. And so I just wanted to throw that out, that we have to find a way to harmonize we can't become unisex, and we can't have matriarchal or patriarchal. So when I hear women say, well, we don't want any structure, what I'm hearing is that will be to the advantage of women and to the disadvantage of men, because men require something of that structure in order to direct that male energy. So it's hard to harmonize.
To throw something in, if I might. I was not emphasizing no structure. I was emphasizing getting to know each other before there was a structure imposed upon the group. I was in no way saying that I am not an advocate of structure. I think some forms of structure are important to a group to make it work and have action, which is the point of the group, to have action. I don't think, however, that the way to have action is to have these male, I like to think of them as slots, where you can put certain female ideas through these male slots. I think it's important to open up those slots to make a slide and have everybody's ideas go down to the main action at the bottom.
Well, that's why I like individual consensus, right down to an individual level, because there are isms in this culture that I feel are even more prevalent and subversive than sexism, such as bodies. That being overweight is difficult for people to come out of their shyness, because they're always getting a first judgment that they have to fight against all their lives, wherever they go, down the street or whatever. And so with an individual consensus, the facilitator calls on that person to make their statement. And it may be the first time in years that they've actually been called on to make a statement. And you do your best to bring that out. So sexism and racism may be focused on, but there's all kinds of prejudgments we make on each other.
Yeah, and I think that there's a need for a structure in that setting up pathways of openness, and that you can organize things in a lot of different ways. But if you don't have it so that every member of the group knows how to communicate with the other members, how to influence them, and has a piece of that power somehow openly there, then these little pockets and eddies develop, and that's one of the important things as a conduit. And it can be there are a number of ways that can be fair depending on situations and who's involved. But having everybody understand some of the ways that it works really helps bring someone who doesn't have isn't loud or dominating, but allows them the ability to come forth.
Something I wanted to add, back to what David was talking about, of replacing a patriarchy with a matriarchy. And as a male in the Student Coalition for Social Responsibility, I'm personally very happy that I think we avoided that problem completely. And I think one of the things that helped us avoid that problem of just switching dominant groups was that very early on, when the women were feeling a lot of discontent with the way things were going, they talked to a couple of us, and so us men said, yeah, we feel that way too. And so we were somehow able to not make it a male-female issue, that men feel this way and women feel this way, and never will the two meet. We were able to realize that it was a structure problem in a lot of ways, the patriarchal structure, and that a lot, if not all of the men in the group were just as unhappy with the patriarchal structure as the women were, although a lot of us were just so used to it that we just couldn't even conceive of the alternative. I remember Bridget talking about female sharing once, and I was telling her that I really wanted to experience that because I wasn't altogether sure what it was. And I think that we were able to do that in our later meetings. And so I feel real excited about the way we avoided just having a backlash and switching who is in power, but actually worked through our problems and achieved a balance for each individual.
Heather, you wanted to say something?
One of the things that we do at the Rainbow Gatherings, I've been involved with them for 20 years now, and we have a council system set up where everyone sits in a circle, anyone who wishes to speak, and we have an object such as a feather or a bowl or something that designates who the speaker is, and that's passed around. We pass it around to the left, and everyone sits in a circle, and they're equal, and they can see one another, and then we pass that around, and if you have something that you want to say, you can speak when you have the feather. And children are involved, older people, everyone, is perfectly welcome to be there. And if you don't want to say anything, you can just hold the feather for a little while and then pass it on. And then that feather can be passed around, the circle many times until everyone feels satisfied that everyone has had, their say in what they have to say. And I recall at the 1972 gathering, we had about 30,000 people together from all over the place, and lots of different ideas and voices. And we were having a council meeting, and one of the young children that came from my community in California spoke up at the council. And he was, maybe 5 years old, 6 at the most, and he took the feather and he stood out in the middle of the circle, and he says, there's too much pollution here. He says, there's too much smoke in the air. He says, everybody has their own campfire, and I'm having a hard time breathing, and there's just too much smoke. And I really think that people should gather together in their neighborhoods and share their fires at night instead of everyone having their own fire at their camp. And this way we would cut down on the smoke in the air. And this came from a 5-year-old boy, and he had that was what happened. We implemented his idea, and that became what happened, and it works out really well. The circle is so different from this side and that side. When you're sitting in a circle, you feel more community, you feel more a part of a whole. And when you share your information in a circle like that, then everyone has the information and can come to a good decision together. And that helps a lot. And the people who, maybe it's their first time at a council and they might not say anything the first time, eventually they'll feel comfortable enough to speak out. And the respect is there for the softer voices, for the younger people, for the, wherever people are coming from. That respect is really important, and realizing that some of the best ideas could come from really, surprising places.
Kind of like the cookie bakers you mentioned to me yesterday.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think that we pride ourselves on at Montana People's Action is finding a place for everyone to fit in. There's a story that I like to share about the person who is the great cookie baker, and a lot of times we'll have somebody in the group that is very soft-spoken, just has some ideas. When you visit them at home, they're real willing to share and to talk with you, but to get into a group, they're very hesitant. But perhaps this person is an excellent cookie baker, and so that's their assignment, to get them to come to the meeting. Is that way they have a job to do, they feel very important, that's a specific thing that they're accustomed to doing. It sets value to their being there by bringing that plate of cookies, and as the group meetings and stuff go on, you'll always usually hear from that person and brings out their ideas. You've given them a chance to come and participate in something they feel comfortable in doing, and then opens the door to their participation in your group. And we've tried to concentrate on that more and more, of finding each person's uniqueness and individuality and incorporating in that to the work that we're doing. And I think it leads to much stronger group process with the folks coming in, because we are pretty structured in that we have elected representation for each section of the group that we're at, neighborhood-wise, locally, community-wise, and on the state level. But that still helps to validate each person's participation in the organization. And I think we've grown much stronger by doing that.
Well, thanks. This has been really interesting and informative to me, and I'd like to thank everybody for sharing it with me. I think we're just about out of time, so any last comments? This would be the time.
I'd like to make one comment about how the consensus process can work in a large group. I was part of a group of people who decided that it would be a good idea to occupy a nuclear power plant, the Trojan power plant up in north of Portland, Oregon. And a group of 126 people got arrested and were taken to a local fairgrounds, actually, to be held. And a lot of these people had never met before. And in order to make decisions, things came up during the time when they were incarcerated, where they had to make decisions as a group. And what they would do would be to break down into 12 different groups of approximately 10 people each and discuss whatever the issue was that they needed to make a decision on. And then they would choose one person from each group to come together. And everyone else would stay in the larger circle, and those 12 or 13 people would sit in the center and discuss the issue where everyone could hear. And if no decision could be made, then they would go back out into the groups and discuss it again with the individual groups. And then, again, pick a spokesperson. It could be a different person or the same, it wouldn't matter. And then those folks would go back into the center, and eventually a decision could be made about whatever the issue was. And in that way, it was a large group of over 100 people who could actually get everyone's thoughts out, and a decision could come from the group. And there was some really tense times that happened during that meeting, and it worked beautifully, so that the spokes were able to bring out everyone's feelings instead of having to go all the way around the circle with 126 people trying to express their feelings. This was a way that by breaking down into these small groups and then into the spokes and then back out again, it worked very quickly to make decisions.
It's a lot less intimidating than having to stand up in front of 100 people to say whatever you're feeling. You're in that smaller group.
And the spokespeople are representative of their group, and the group can hear exactly what they're saying, so there's no misrepresentation in the smaller group. There's no secretness about it or any misrepresentation. And they have to go back into their group again, and if they said something that was inappropriate, the group would call them on it. So that worked really well, and some real tense situation happened there that some of the law decided that they would arrest all the people who were second offenders and take them off separately, take them off to jail. And the folks decided, no, we don't want any of our people to be taken separately. We're all here together. And so it was decided amongst the group that they would, not cooperate when they were being arraigned, taken off into separate rooms to be arraigned. So they would have to drag people off. And it got pretty tense, and it was a real important decision that was made, but it did work. It worked beautifully, and they came to that decision in probably about 5 minutes, and they had to decide, now what are we going to do?
I'd like to say one thing for viewers who aren't familiar with consensus process. The most radical moment is when the one person objects morally to the action of another 100 people, and for that reason that action is scrapped, and how that person is treated will tell you the maturity level of the people involved.
Well, thanks for this. Has been really good. I'm glad that we that you were able to finish up with that, and I think that we're all it's an ongoing social experiment, and all of these groups we're in evolve, and we all learn as we go along, and that's probably what we're here for.